Okay. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to the first Budget 101 presentation that was developed as a teaching tool for our community to help our community to better understand some of the workings of the development of a school budget. So last year, Victor and I learned a lot of lessons about opportunities that we had to provide more information about how a budget is developed. We learned very clearly last year that it's really too late in March to kind of try to provide some understandings around some fairly complex, processes that's involved in budget development. So we're using the Budget 101s as a basis for providing some foundational information about school budgeting, with the hopes that that'll help the community to really understand some of the components, some of the decisions, some of the things that we can change and have control over, and things that we can't, and ways in which our budget reflects certain principles that both Victor and Chris, who he'll introduce shortly, will explain in greater detail. We also want to remind our public that these meetings are being taped, and they will be on our website. So for any community member who's not able to attend an actual meeting, we're also going to develop a frequently asked question document, which will also be on our website. I want to thank Ms. Morgan for being here to capture all of the important details that we want to make sure are shared. We'll also provide a clearer place on our website that's easy and one click that you can get to find all the resources associated with our Budget 101 presentations. And we'll talk more about the budget advisory, which Victor will go to in greater detail. So I want to start with one of the infographics that Victor and I worked on over the weekend with someone who is going to be involved in really helping us to present information in ways that are potentially more accessible. And one of the first infographics has to do with what's sort of the focus or the vision that the district has around educating all children. And as you know, we've been engaged since March of 2016 in the adoption and implementation of our strategic coherence plan, which is a set of guiding principles around how we are going to educate all children to be successful in life, work, and the future. And these skills are really the sort of foundation for all the decisions that we make, because we are here, all of our facilities, all of our classrooms, all of the adults here are here in service to those larger goals. So the first infographic is really, sort of a shorthand set of images that represents all of that. And all of these symbols are probably at this point pretty clear and notable. And as you know, our bears, our graduates, are really the center of our focus.
On the next slide, I posted the profile.
The next slide has to do with the whole budget development process. All of these conversations happen long before we go into the new year, and Victor will talk about that. So while it might start in October, we start this process as soon as the May budget vote, in terms of talking about what we would like, in addition to those things that are already that the public has already voted on. But there are always things that budget managers would like to take place, and then we start thinking about how to make sure those things are part of next year. And all of those things are all driven by good decision making and a thoughtful process. These are not frivolous things that are just good to have. Our budget managers are not asking for new file cabinets or pencil dispensers. They're asking for real resources that help to educate all our children well around those guiding principles that are underlined in our strategic coherence plan. So I'm going to turn it over to Victor now, who will take you through the rest of the presentation to really drill down into some of the components of budgeting, and then introduce Chris, who's going to talk about a pretty important concept that came up last year during a number of our budget meetings, which is this concept of zero-based budgeting. He'll talk about that along with another concept and what that really means, and what's the evidence of that already in practice in our district and others. So Victor.
So this presentation is meant to be interactive, so if at any point you have any questions, feel free to chime in, stop me, we'll have a discussion, we'll clarify anything that needs clarification. So as Dr. Heng mentioned, this process, it formally begins in October, and the principals and directors of each department begin building their budgets based on their program needs for the next school year. Information trickles in beginning in September. External information begins trickling in. We just got in September the employee retirement system contribution rates for next year. In November, we got an estimate of the employer contribution rates for the TRS, Teachers Retirement System. So information begins trickling in, and then ultimately in April, on April 1st, the state adopts its final version of the budget. The draft version, or the executive budget proposal, we receive in January. We also receive information in January about the tax cap. So that relies heavily on the consumer price index. So you'll hear at our board meetings, we often talk about where's the CPI trending at this point in time, what does it look like it's going to project to. Also included in the tax cap is a tax base growth factor, which is reported by the assessor's office and becomes available to us usually in January and February. So information trickles in throughout the year, which is why it's such a long process that we're not able to prepare and present a completed budget in December because we don't have all of the information at that point. So it really takes until April for it to become finalized once all the information is available. So here's just an infographic of the different factors that impact our budget. And every year we present a balanced budget to the community, and we're balancing between the needs of the district versus the ability of our taxpayers to support the schools, our limited state funding and federal funding, and then the very small other revenues that we receive. This infographic will be up on our budget website. I know it's very hard to see out there, but it's in your handout and it's going to be on our website. So again, Chris Koff, partner from O'Connor Davies PKF, is here to discuss zero-based budgeting and historical consumption budgeting. Chris, if you wouldn't mind, just give an introduction to yourself and a little bit about your background.
Sure. For 30 years, I worked for Rockland County. I graduated to the point where I was the Commissioner of Finance. After retiring from there, I moved on to O'Connor Davies, where I became a partner in the municipal division. While I was at Rockland, one of my functions was to work with the budget department in putting together the budget. Their budget was over $800 million and encompassed many different types of services, health, hospitals. We had a highway department like everybody else, corrections, jails. For PKF, our clients actually hire us to review their budgets. So when their budget is presented to their legislature, we actually review on their behalf the numbers and the positions and the assumptions that they made in their budget. So currently, just today actually, I left Westchester County where we're reviewing the $1.9 billion submission that County Executive Latimer presented to the legislature to vote on.
That's billion with a B. Right?
It's billion with a B. We've also done budget work for Orange County. I presented that report about 3 weeks ago, and that's about $800 million. And we do work for Ulster County, Dutchess County, and Rockland County, and the city of Yonkers, again, as a school district with about $500, $600 million budget, and the city itself is another $500 or $600 million. So we've seen a lot of different techniques when we review these budgets as to how they're put together. So we'll talk about the two different methods. You hear a lot about zero-based budgeting, and then there's also what we call historical consumption. So when you're doing zero-based budgeting, the theory behind that was originally is it doesn't matter what happened in the past, throw it out and start again. All right? It's very hard for a municipality to do. Municipalities use a hybrid of the two methods. So when you look at zero-based budgeting, how are you going to do that for utilities? How are you going to do it for certain functions, supplies, materials, repairs? You do have to use historical knowledge. I have never seen a budget relies on one method only. Each area can use even a combination of the two. And we'll get into that in the next slide when we talk a little bit about the areas. And the history is very important to municipalities because, again, school districts are considered a municipality because they have to rely on trends that they've seen over time also. So when you look at a budget for municipality, the biggest piece is going to be your salaries and fringes. And that basically is zero-based budget. You have contracts, you know the number of teachers, you know your number of employees. You have to pay them a certain salary that's in the contract. You can't just say, well, I'm going to pay this person X. You have to meet your contractual needs. So you start at zero, really, and you work your way up to your number. Okay? Same thing with fringe benefits. When you think about it, again, you have an employee on your payroll. If they're married, you're going to have to put in health insurance for a married person. If they're single, you put in single. And if you have HMOs or their options, whatever that employee elected. Okay? You also have FICA, you have retirement. All of that is known at the time, and that's basically zero-based budgeting. Now, we'll stop there. You'll say, well, why isn't that all zero-based budgeting? And the reason it's not entirely zero-based budgeting is you also know that people are going to retire. People are going to come on the payroll, off the payroll. When an employee, long-time service retires, you hire them and replace them usually with a new hire that's at a lower salary. That's budget flexibility. What that does is allow you to meet all your budget needs. So you can't be perfect. You can't guarantee somebody's going to stay on your payroll for the 365 days of your budget cycle. So people come and people go. When you go up to debt service, again, basically zero-based budgeting. You know your debt. You have bonds outstanding, you know the principal that's due, you know the interest that's due, you put your budget together. The only time you may use some historical or an estimate is if you know you're going to issue a bond during the course of the year because the voters approved the project. And just because they approved it doesn't mean you're going to immediately run out and borrow the money. You're going to wait till you need it. So you have capital projects underway, you look at your cash flow, you may borrow that bond in various components over the course of the year. So they have to put in an estimate for what that interest payment may be, depending again on the time you take you issue the bonds. So you may put in an estimate for an interest payment where the principal you can defer to the following year, so you can include it again as zero-based budgeting if you want to use that term. The other area of your budget is equipment, contractual supplies. This is where the hybrid comes in. Again, depending on your policy, most departments, we'll talk about equipment first, have to request equipment by item. They don't just say, I need X number of dollars to budget for equipment. They have to say, I need an overhead projector, I need a laptop, I need this, I need that. And then that's reviewed by a team and you make a determination. So that would be zero-based budgeting. But at the same time, you also don't know the price of all that equipment because you may have to go out to bid. So if somebody needs a vehicle, a truck, a plow, you know it's in the past cost X number of dollars, that may be what you include in the budget, but then you go out and bid and you may have to come up with money because the bid came in higher, or you may save money because the bid comes in lower. Again, you can't control that at the beginning during the budget process. When you get to supplies, and again, Victor can assist me a little bit here because supplies are a little different, but when we review budgets, we really use historical because paper products for copy machines, toners. You don't know exactly how many toners you're going to use. It depends on how much you print. So you kind of look at a trend. Over the past 5 years, I've used 100 toner cartridges, so I'm going to use 100 toners. I know I need textbooks for this class, so I know I'm going to need textbooks, so you have to estimate what the cost of the books are. You don't exactly know what they're all going to be. And you also don't know what science projects are going to come up during the year. So again, you have to look at historical trends. So you're going to use a hybrid on the supply account. You look at, I know I'm going to need X, but I also don't know what I don't know. The repairs and your maintenance is another area where historical is probably the most important. Utilities. You have X number of buildings. It's cost you over time $100,000. We'll just use a number. But you don't know what your new rate's going to be. If it's a bad winter, you may run the heat longer. If it's a hot summer, you're going to run air conditioning longer. So you don't want to just put in a number. You want to look at trends. So you know that the utility rate was approved for 1 or 2%. You may use that as your estimate for your baseline to move forward, but you don't want to leave yourself short. Again, you get the repairs and maintenance. You don't know what's going to break down over the course of the year. But historically, you have maintenance programs, your preventive maintenance contracts you budget for, but you don't know what's going to break during the course of the year. Students do have a tendency every now and then to break something, and you need to have enough money in there to cover those repairs. And what happens is, you use historical numbers, and if you don't use it, hopefully you can apply that number to an area where you may be under budgeted a little bit. So we like to call that budget flexibility. You have to include enough for emergencies, but at the same time, you don't want to include so much. So if you have a little bit in each of these accounts, that gives you flexibility. Unfortunately, if something major happened, you'd have the funds to address that issue. So hopefully that explains a little bit about the differences between the two.
And I'm just going to go into detail on those three categories. So as Chris mentioned, salaries and benefits, we do approach it as a zero-based approach. And here's an example of that. Or before I get into that, here are the things that we're considering with each of our staffing decisions. So each position is evaluated based on our board policy, which stipulates class sizes. I've embedded the link. I included it in the handout, so you can take a look at that while you're sitting there. Also, we look at projected enrollment, which is prepared each fall for the next year. We also look at individualized education plans, IEPs, that usually comes out of CSE meetings that take place in the spring, and also any special course offerings, whether or not we're offering AP courses or things of that nature. So here's an example. If we had a retirement, we would evaluate that position against the projected class sizes. So in this example, we had a retirement at the elementary level, and we have a 5th grade cohort that's exiting, which is 30 students greater than an incoming kindergarten cohort. So here are the things that we would consider. Is the position still needed at the elementary level? We could use that teacher to then go to a different grade and lower class sizes with that cohort. Is the position needed at the middle school because now the 30 students are coming in there? Or does the middle school also have another 30 students exiting and their total enrollment remains the same? Is there another need somewhere else in the district? Or can the position be eliminated through attrition and not replaced? So each of those considerations are discussed and considered during the budget process. And as Chris mentioned earlier, with regard to retirements, we do take into account our retirements. Fortunately, in our collective bargaining agreements, our retirees announced in September, so we're able to actually build into the budget the replacement costs, as he mentioned, of the replacement teachers who come in replacing teachers at the top of the salary schedule. Equipment, contractual supplies, and BOCE services. Again, it's a hybrid method that we've used over the past. So usually about this time we'll have an idea of where our budget will be for next year, and we'll provide parameters to the principal and director to develop their budget increase. They'll also consider the needs of the district and the programming needs of the building. So for example, we're going to be implementing a new math program. So in implementing that new math program, we're going to know that we need material supplies. We're going to need professional learning opportunities for staff to be able to implement this new curriculum. So they'll go through their budget. They'll identify every single add to their budget. They'll also look and see which items were implemented in the past year, which they could remove. So when the principal or director comes to the district office, we all sit down with central administration and the principal director to review their budget request. We compare that to the strategic coherence plan, and we make sure that they stay within their budget parameters. So as Chris mentioned, they know how much they're going to be spending on supplies and paper and toner and all that stuff. Textbooks, they'll know. They may have bought English textbooks in the year prior, and now they're no longer purchasing English textbooks. Instead, they're purchasing science textbooks. So while the dollars will shift, they're all identified in detail, by each principal and director.
When does that take place, Victor?
So we have our budget meeting scheduled for early December with the principals and directors. So they're already in the process of drafting their budgets. And then each year, you may know this, each year in February, we impose a mid-year spending moratorium. So by February, they should know with relative certainty everything that they're going to need to get them through the spring of the school year. So we cut off spending at that point. All of their orders should be placed, and the other reason why we do that is to assist us in projecting our fund balance. Because one thing that we do every year is we project our fund balance to see what our position will be entering the next year.
And Victor, just one thing before you go into that. This is not a comfortable position in terms of sitting at the board at the meetings with the budget managers, because we are the no people. We go through each line and question every single expenditure from year to year, from whether someone wants to buy pencils to, why do you have this? Explain what this means. So that a great deal of scrutiny goes into that process that's behind the scenes, and we're not very popular people when that happens, but we have to do that. And Susan's shaking her head over there because she knows we have to do that. And when Victor says there's a moratorium, Victor makes it impossible for there to be additional purchases. You cannot override and purchase something. And a dirty little secret not associated with Victor, But in certain districts, there's not necessarily a moratorium. What happens is most budget managers know when they're probably going to get a message from somebody like Victor or in Victor's position, and they spend out of those budgets right away. Our administrators and budget managers don't do that. That's a practice that we really strive to make sure that they understand that anything that they don't have to purchase, that's better for the district, in terms of the next budget cycle. So that's a really significant, those last couple of bullets are really significant parts of the process that are very much behind the scenes, but very critical in establishing the best, most fiscally sound budget that we can produce.
And in support of that, they recognize that staff is more important than stuff. So they're making their best effort to purchase as few things in order to free up funds that could be invested in staff, because they recognize the value of staff over stuff. So, and again, we scrutinize their budget. We make them come back again and present, well, why do you need this? And provide support, provide documentation of why it is that you need this, why it's important, why you can't do X instead of Y. So we really do scrutinize the budget managers, and you're right, we probably aren't very popular during December.
I'd also assume that this process helps you because as people are buying products during the year, if they know you're going to implement a moratorium, they may try to sneak POs through earlier in the year for larger quantity. So your scrutiny of that stops that process also. Because if they have 30 students, you don't allow them to buy 40 books.
No.
So this mid-year moratorium really helps you eliminate that concern people have of everybody just spending their budget because it's available.
Exactly.
And they don't.
It's a good process.
And you can see from our past results that they don't.
Right.
So.
I'm sorry, any questions on zero-based budgeting before we go forward? Anything about the last couple of slides?
Yeah, in looking and hearing the explanation of what it means, it sounds like, well, I'll ask. Do we already do zero-based budgeting for salaries and benefits and debt service?
We do.
And the equipment supplies, we do that zero-based plus historical consumption?
It's a combination. So for example, if at the elementary school, the building level budget, and I'm just using a round number, was $100,000, what we would say in October, recognizing the things that we know to date. Right now, we know that the TRS pension contribution rate is going to be lower. ERS is going to be lower. We just learned that health insurance isn't going to be horrific, but not so great. We know at this point what the parameters are going to be. So we'll present to the principals and directors, and we'll say, based on last year's historical consumption, you're able to accommodate an X% increase. So they'll know what the parameters are, and they'll build their budget within those parameters. So just say, for example, of a $100,000 budget last year, and we say you're allowed a 2% increase. So now you have a budget of $102,000. They will build their budget within those parameters, identifying each of the items that make up that $102,000. But they may have done something that was a one-time implementation in the past year that they no longer need to do. However, now we know we have a new math program. So they'll shift those funds and relocate them into a math program, and they may have taken them out of some other area. So that's why it's kind of a combination in that we provide the parameters based on historical cost, because we know if they're replacing textbooks, for example, they may have replaced English last year and now they're going to be purchasing math, but they have the same number of students and textbooks are relatively the same cost. They'll shift from English textbooks into math textbooks, but really the consumption remains constant, and that's the cost to operate a building.
But I would assume in addition to that, if one department needed more than your 2%, the others might not get their 2%.
Exactly.
Right.
So it's not like
Right.
guaranteed that they're going to get that too.
Right.
That's just for the submission to you as administration
Correct.
to review, and then you have to mold it into the entire district's budget. And everybody may not get everything they requested because you have a dire need somewhere else, and you have to fill that need, right?
And most don't get what they requested. I mean, it just doesn't work that way. we do the best that we can, but certainly we look at opportunities, whether it's through a consortium pricing system through BOCES. We're always looking at BOCES as a way to help defray some of the costs by going into a co-suitable agreement, so that us, along with us, other districts can benefit. The more districts that participate in those kinds of agreements, the lower the price or the cost is to each district. So we always start with BOCES as the place that we look to, as a potential savings. One of the other areas associated with textbooks is, obviously, since we are in a one-to-one Chromebook adoption district, we're encouraging our liaisons, who are the heads of the departments, to look for ways for us to use online text resources. There are many, many more, and districts or some of our departments, certainly here at the high school, have gone away from textbooks because they're pretty much obsolete when they are printed and sent out to the schools. And we want to make sure that our educators are using the resources that are online, that are really plentiful and much more accurate in terms of the availability of things. And in most cases, it's open source, meaning they're free to the districts. So even if we know those things, whether it's a paper or printed book or it's online, we check with the printers and the publishers of those resources, and we always know a price, and we always negotiate the lowest price. The one thing that districts have to our advantage is mass. So if you say you're buying something for a class of 250 students, that means something to a textbook or a vendor, because then they're going to work with us, and they typically do. And so we're always looking, even within all of those structures, we're looking for ways to maximize the dollars in the district and to find every savings that we possibly can.
And the other thing that we didn't speak about that impacts your budget is your partner, New York State. They provide state aid. So when you're putting your budget together, you have a number in your mind of what the state aid is going to be, and if it doesn't come to that number by the time you're going to adopt, it's got to come out of the department's budget submissions a lot of times to stay within the tax cap.
And that's huge.
And I think you just went through a period of time of 5 years when they're holding back money, and they just started getting you back to where you should be.
Yeah, there's still
So you had to deal with that.
Nowhere near where we're supposed to be.
Correct.
That's a discussion for, I want to say, this February 12th. Maybe.
Right, but you don't know that number in December as you start
No.
to give goals.
No.
So again,
And even in January.
you're just giving parameters, not etched in stone.
And even in January, we get the governor's proposal, and it's completely different when April 1st hits. So, question.
Yeah, so I recently changed rules at my company, but it's a company that's very aggressive on fiscal responsibility. Previously, I ran P&L of $300 million revenue, about $100 million in expense. And we are started out zero every year in the sense of, I get, the necessities. But when we say that, you use the round number of 100,000 and that there's a 2%. So you're going to the building and saying, all right, you have $102,000 to spend. That, I think, is where some of the challenge comes in. You know what paper is going to be, that's consumption. You know building expenses, that's great. You have to look at the historical. But everything else should be, on a zero. In fact, I'm not told how much money I'm going to get. I have to come up with the initiatives that I'm going to do next year. What is going to build my business? So I have to list out what's going to have the biggest impact, what's an absolute need, what's a nice to have, but how does that help me grow my business later? And it matches back to professional development, to new programs. So you guys might not have to generate that revenue, but you have to show what that investment is. But going to a group and saying, hey, you have $100,000 to play with, what do you want to do with that, is where people start to go and look, and they're like, well, what if we, dividing it into three groups of, this is what we absolutely must have in order to keep the lights on. This is what we need to be successful, and this is what we need to be even better. And having that justification is what helps businesses, what helps management in any sector be able to say, have to have, these are the last priorities. So, when we talked about, zero-based budgeting at that point in time. So on the flip side, my husband works at a very wealthy school, and he orders very few things, and the gym teacher next to him has a closet full of stuff because he can. I've also heard stories at many other schools, including Brewster, that have that kind of thing. How do we make it that you're able to say, I have to have, this is what's best to have, and then this is the nice to have? So that people don't know what that dollar amount is going in, but there's a justification across the table of this one needs this, and that trumps that. And then you go down the line of being able to figure out what is the best expenditure that the district could make to make it overall successful.
I would say that at this point in time, in 17, 18, each building has identified their must-haves, and that's where they're living right now. So if you look at the building level budgets now compared to a few years ago, they haven't really grown, but our programs have, and the needs have. So even that, in that example, a 2% parameter, their needs are way above the 2% parameter that we provided to them. So again, when they get to the table with Michelle and Valerie and me and Kathy Culligan, they're staying within the parameter, and they're saying, and just so you know, I want to do this, but I can't do this here, for this amount of money. So their need is well above and beyond what their allocation is, and it's never been any different. There's no lack of need in any of the buildings. I can't imagine there being waste within any of the buildings or departments. There's nothing but need, and we keep them at parameters. I mean, if you ask any one of our principals or directors, if we had $25,000 for you, what would you do with it? Within an instant, they'd be able to provide an answer to you. And that's our control, is to keep within those parameters. Not buying it.
I've seen the waste, and you can hear it from what was thrown out at Garden Street was criminal. So I've seen the waste, I've heard the waste, and that is one of the frustrations of the community, is that there's things that are wasteful.
At Garden Street, what was thrown out there?
Foundations was tossed out. Tons of books were tossed out. Even if we just went and swarmed the building as a community and packed it up and shipped it off to needier communities, it wouldn't have felt like such a waste that everything was cleared out and put into dumpsters. So that doesn't necessarily tie to the budget. That ties to a wasteful community of not valuing what has been purchased and things that are still viable. Understandable that there are textbooks that go out of date and certain things that go out of date, but there are valuable elements that were tossed in the trash, and those are the elements that actually teach kids the phonetics that they need to actually be able to read, versus teachers' college and other no spelling curriculums and things that are leaving our kids without, I have a 7th grader that can't spell. I just talked to her mother today. Her kid can't spell. And they're dead in the water. There's 5 years worth of classes that are dead in the water because they can't spell. But we have things going out the door. That's another point, but my point is that I've seen the waste, and people will talk about the waste, and that's the frustration point.
Unfortunately, only because I know this, teachers were in and out of Garden Street retrieving whatever they could, and they were retrieving foundations. I don't know who you spoke to, but I can tell you teachers went in and out, choosing, selecting, trying to find things that they could salvage. Many of the things were not usable anymore because they had sat in the building and were moldy. So there's no way that we could dispense those. I know even before I arrived, there was a community, come and take whatever you'd like to take. I mean, that's before I arrived, and that's what I was told. And many of those books were just given to the community, those, student readers or serial readers or whatever they were taken and distributed, as you said. We didn't do, but that is what we did do. Plenty of time where, there were plenty of opportunities for our teachers to have gone there. We even had a textbook seller so that we could sell them and get some money back. And I think we did that. We got it was a nominal amount, about $600 from things that, at the very last, that was our very last attempt to clear out things there that could potentially either be used or things that we could sell and get some profit from. We did go to a new ELA program. We're not the only one. In most cases, it's a rarity for districts not to be using a research-based curriculum to Teachers College, which Ms. Gosh can speak to. The word study component that's added, that does include spelling and vocabulary and all the conventions that that are very important to that program. So I don't know if you want to mention the word study.
I'm familiar with it, and I've talked about it. I'm pleased about it. I think that we have a 5-year gap that's hurting some of our other kids that did not get a word study. I have it now at home with one of my guys, and it's a great program. I'm thrilled about it. I want us to be mindful of how do we best utilize every last resource that we have at our disposal. And I think we have some gaps there, and I want to make certain that that doesn't happen again.
Or we can have our Dean Berardo look at closets to see, how many things are there that are wasteful. I mean, we can have our budget managers look at closets and other
I don't want
things.
us to go on a scavenging hunt
No,
for
but
the
this-
building.
this
I just
topic-
want it to be like every single thing is aligned. Like, hey, Dean, how many do you need of these? Because these are disgusting and they're never going to be able
That's
to
what
be
we do.
salvaged.
That's what we do. We go through our budget lines. People just don't present us with a budget and say, here, this is what I want. They have to justify every line, and there are probably about 30 lines in each of those building-based budgets that we go through with a great deal of scrutiny and care. I can tell you that because I can compare it to other districts that I've been in where the same thing has happened. That is a very serious process. So you might not be present, Jamie, when we're there doing it, but it does happen with a great deal of fidelity so that we are watching every dollar that the district has at its disposal to spend in service to our children.
And we're going to be presenting a 101 specific to those topics, and I want to say it is the January 101. So we'll make sure that we have representatives of the principals and directors at that meeting, and they can speak to specifics about the types of items that they purchase, what their inventory is, and how they manage that. So we're definitely going to hit on that, and we can have a much more in-depth conversation, I want to say, on January 11th, maybe. We'll talk about it.
I'm not keeping it coming at these.
You have to. We need interaction. So when somebody's at home watching this, come to the next one. We need you to participate.
Yeah. Well, this is where we're trying to provide information that's helpful. I mean, unless you work in a school district or you're sitting at a table defending your budget, you can't know this. Nobody would know this. Like, we can't speak to the jobs that you do and what levels of scrutiny you have to engage in when you have to present a budget. We can't speak to that. We can only speak to what we're doing, which is consistent with what other districts do. And we have Chris here, who is our outside expert because he audits huge municipalities, and he would know better than anyone in this room, what goes into making these decisions and how you come out at the end, in the ways in which, we have come out, which is, certainly not overshooting the tax cap, but, being very diligent about, how we spend and budget.
And you'll see that in a couple of slides. So just as we
Can I
talk,
pass on one observation along the subject because you just invited the public to come out?
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I've noticed from all my public meetings over the 38 years I've done this is people usually only come out to complain about a reduction in a program that affected maybe their child or for the municipality, their neighborhood. It'd be helpful if people came out and participated in the process early so that the feedback can be taken into account. But they usually only come out if it's a reduction in a program that is, for municipality, their neighborhood, or the school, it's maybe a program that they, maybe got carved out of a budget due to a budget crunch. That's when people come out. So it'd be helpful if people came out with ideas early, because as a former person that put budgets together, that input would be nice,
so again,
I think
debt
there's a
service.
question.
If I just,
Oh yeah.
real quick, with the salaries, when we're faced with state mandates, such as we're adding the additional school counselors, whether it's this year or next year, and then you put that into the calculation, so this one's retiring, there's money floating here, there's additional things here, so that's part of the whole budgeting process?
Absolutely, and just going back to that slide. So for example, we had a retirement. Is there another need elsewhere in the district? If there was no other need of that position, we would then substitute that position, a teaching position, with the elementary school counselors, which is a mandate. So we have to do that. So that would be part of our consideration in what to do with this retirement. Absolutely. So debt service, again, we talked about, it's pretty cut and dry. Our amortization schedules are defined and we need to make our principal and interest payments on. So now our next topic of discussion is contingency. So how much contingency should we put in the budget for the unknown? And here are some considerations of unknown expenditures that come up throughout any given year. Employees on long-term medical leave, it could be for a workers' comp issue, it could be for a sick leave or a maternity leave. New IEP requirements, if a student requires a one-to-one aid, if they require additional related services, or if unfortunately we're unable to accommodate that student in district and we now need to place that student at an out-of-district placement in a private school or maybe another public school, we have to pay for the tuition and the transportation of that student. Utility increases, either in consumption or price. Chris mentioned before, is it a hot summer where you're cranking the AC more than you were in the prior year or more than average? Or is it a really cold winter where you're burning therms of natural gas more than you have in prior years? Facility repairs come up. Reductions in state and federal aid. 2 years ago, we were very frightened with the prospect of a reduction in our federal aid for our ESSA grants. Tax certiorari or other legal issues, those things come up from time to time. Just this year, here's an example for this year. We were just notified by the New York City Department of Environmental Protection that we were required to implement and install stormwater erosion measures for the capital project that we completed 2 years ago for the CV Star building addition and the JFK building addition. They came 2 years later to tell us, oh, by the way, you now need to install $100,000 worth of drainage and plantings and a rain barrel that's going to go behind the concession stand. Those are things that you cannot contemplate 16, 18 months in advance of the budget development process. So again, it's important, and the controller recommends that we have funds set aside for the unknown. So while they say you need to set aside funds, they will never define what you should set aside. So while they don't define it in a step-by-step booklet, what we're able to ascertain by reading controllers' audits of other municipalities is what is considered reasonable. So fortunately, in Brewster, we had an audit performed back in the 13-14 year, and this is an excerpt from that audit report. The full report is embedded here, and it's available on our website. The Controller's Office said, we compared the district's budgeted revenues and expenditures for the general fund with the actual results of operations for fiscal years 10-11 through 12-13 and found that the district officials generally developed reasonable budgets over a 3-year period. So they said this is a reasonable budget, but they didn't say what the parameters were. So let's look at those 3 years which were audited. So in 10-11, and I equate this to a test score just for simplicity. So our budget within those years under audit scored between 94.8 and 98.4, which the controller deemed as reasonable. So you see here, again, the range is 94.8% expended to 98.4% expended. And in terms of dollars, Brewster underspent the budget by $4.3 million in that year, $2.9 in that year, and $1.4 in that year. Again, all deemed reasonable to the Controller's Office. And I just included in here our most recent year, 17-18, and you can see that we underspent the budget by $1.3 million, or if you look at it alternatively, we spent 98.6% of the budget, meaning we are flying much closer to the sun now than we had under these years in which the Controller's Office deemed as reasonable. Chris, you look like you wanted to say something.
All right, next slide. The next one.
Just Victor, before you go further, so when you're sitting down to do the budget, obviously you're looking at historical, but what are you putting in? So if you got a $100 million budget, what are you saying I need to have contingency on? And then, I don't know if you're going to cover this later, the guidelines on the spending of that contingency. You know, I think those are the things that get a little bit squirrely, that people want to understand better, of being able to say, all right, great, we got, you know, a $2 million contingency. How is that used? What are the allowances allowed within that? What are the guidelines and so forth?
It usually approaches the board level at that point, which is, the conversation that we're having right now. But it actually I may be able to answer your question with this next slide.
Okay.
So, again, we say that in our, what's reasonable? So let's first answer that. So what's reasonable? So we have about, our budget right now is $98 million. So let's just call it $100 million. In a $100 million budget, we're a relatively large school district as compared to our neighbors in Lower Westchester. So I came from Tuckahoe. My budget when I left Tuckahoe was about $30 million. I talked about all of those things that can affect the budget, the things that are unknown. If you have, for example, I don't want to use, an unplanned event. So say, unfortunately, and I hate to use this example, but
Just use the one you just used, the plantings and that.
right, sure. So if you have that same $100,000 unplanned event, its impact on a $30 million budget is much more impactful than it would be on a $100 million budget. So on a $30 million budget in Tuckahoe, you might want to have 4 to 5% contingency because it hurts you more when things happen. In a larger budget, like in Brewster's, we try to live within 2 to 3%. That's where we try to live. And here's an example of how we accomplish that. So the other side, I should say the flip side of our contingency is our appropriated fund balance. And the way that I describe our appropriated fund balance is different than the way that Chris will likely describe it. In my estimation, appropriated fund balance is a budgeted reduction in revenue. So we have a $100 million budget in this example. We have a $2 million appropriated fund balance, meaning we're saying that we're using $2 million of our savings to offset our expenditures. We're anticipating that we're going to reach $98 million of our revenues. So all of those other things, our stadium's going to come in to the penny, all of our other revenues are going to come into the penny, all of our tax revenue is going to come into the penny. Assuming everything came into the penny and we had a $2 million appropriated fund balance, we would actually receive $98 million, right, on this $100 million budget. The flip side of that is the expenditure contingency, which we talked about. So we have a $100 million budget. We expect to spend $98 million of that $100 million budget, meaning we're going to underspend the budget by $2 million. If you look at the sum of each of these, it results in a break even, a net change in fund balance of $0. So that's our goal each year, is to break even. But if there are fewer unplanned expenses, our fund balance will increase. So say, for example, we don't have $2 million of contingency in here. Suppose we had a really good year and it was a really warm winter and we had no teachers go out on medical leave, and we actually only spent $97 million in this budget. Our fund balance would increase because we'd have $98 million of revenue and only $97 million of expenses. Our actual fund balance would increase by $1 million. The other side of that would be, suppose all things went against us, and we had DEP telling us that we had $100,000 worth of additional drainage that we needed to do. We had a significant number of employees that go out on medical leave, and we need to not only pay them while they're out on medical leave, but we also have to pay for their replacements. Any number of things that were listed in that slide earlier. Our fund balance would go down. So, and here's on this next slide, here's the actual results of our operations over the past 4 years. So in 14-15, our actual change in fund balance, the real number that our fund balance changed, we had a decrease of $270,000. That's as close to break even as I think we'll ever see. The following year, we had an increase of about $274,000. Again, so incredibly close to breaking even, given the fact that we have a $98 million budget, right? And if you look at it as a percentage of the budget, you see it's peanuts here. The goal is to break even. So in those 2 years, we really came close to breaking even. 16-17, we had a good year. Everything broke in our favor. Our fund balance increased by $1 million. What do we do the following year? Recognizing and meeting with our finance committee, we recognized that we had $1 million surplus from the past year. We didn't want to sit on that. We wanted to make sure that we put that money to use. So what the Finance Committee decided was to apply that surplus to paying down outstanding debt, which saves the district in the long run in terms of interest and principal payments in the future. And that's what led to the decrease of the 17-18 year. So we applied that surplus from the 16-17 year against the 17-18 year's budget in order to save money in the future. Because ultimately what we're trying to do, we're really just trying to maintain our total fund balance. So this is the total money that we have in the bank for a rainy day and for defined reserves, meaning liabilities that we know that we have. And this is our total fund balance. And the reason why we want to maintain this is to protect us from the things that we really don't know about, catastrophic things that could happen where you're reading about now districts that have mold issues and they have massive expenses for mold remediation that's not covered by insurance. And it's our neighbors, I think in North Salem and further up in Dutchess. They're having to expend hundreds of thousands of dollars for mold remediation that of course they couldn't contemplate during the budget process. So they need to pull it out of their fund balance. So it's really important. And when Alan Cassay, the other partner, was here presenting our financial statements, he stressed the importance of maintaining our fund balance.
And you gotta remember, components of your fund balance are limited by state law. Your unassigned piece is only allowed to be 4%. So whether you have a good year or a bad year, it can only be 4%. And if you go over that 4%, it's usually returned in the budget as use of fund balance in the following year.
I'm sorry. So I get the whole fund balance thing, but and the 4%, what was that?
4%, you have buckets of fund balance. You have committed, restricted, assigned, and unassigned. The unassigned piece is limited by state education to 4%.
Of your total budget or of your
Following year's budget.
Of your following?
The other areas are restricted by state law, and the controller's office puts up what you can use them for. So for example,
your unassigned could be $4 million going into next year, and that would be unassigned, meaning that is the money you would be able to use for a catastrophe that's not allocated to something very specific that you guys are held to within your budgeting lines.
Exactly.
So if you look at the 10.7, and I'm going to just use round numbers, and Victor can correct me if I'm wrong, $4 million would be unassigned. I believe you said you appropriated 2.7 to reduce the following year's revenue needs. So that's 6.7. That only leaves $4 million in the other restrictions, which probably would be for tax certiorari's, because you don't know if people are filing grievances. It's also for employee benefits, and because contracts call for buyouts at the end of those benefits, contract periods.
We have a retirement reserve and an unemployment reserve.
Right.
And
those uses are regulated by the controller's office to how you can use them.
Right. And the funding levels of those reserves, which we review annually with our finance committee. So when we meet with our finance committee in June, we're presenting to them our fund balance projection of our best case or our best guess of what our ultimate fund balance will be for the end of the year. We then present to the finance committee, well, here are the liabilities that we see. And here are the recommended reserves to accommodate those liabilities. And the finance committee analyzes that information, and they'll make a recommendation to the Board of Ed for ultimately, how much money we put in each reserve. Keeping in mind the most important thing to protect the district from catastrophe is to maximize that 4% unreserved amount, because that money's free. We wouldn't be able to reach into any of those other reserves for any other purpose besides what it's specified for.
And then what's your interest earned on that average of 10 million? And then where does that money go? Is that part of your revenues, or
part of your
is that
estimated
the
revenue.
Sorry.
Yeah,
It's part of your estimate when they put the budget together. They
But it goes
estimate-
into the revenue?
Yeah, to reduce the need for taxes.
So what is your interest on that?
Not much in the past
Typically.
years.
well, not much, but it's getting better, and our treasurer, Sue Morgan's here, and I think that we're over 2% now with our class investment, right? So we're over 2%.
So it sits in a safe area that you can't, that
Yeah,
doesn't have a little
It's,
ROI?
again, governed by New York state law as to what you can invest in.
In terms of investments, we're extremely limited in our investments. The most
You don't want to
extravagant.
burn up.
No. The most extravagant investment that we can make is in a CD.
Right.
That's it.
And you also have to understand that their rates that they get paid would be less than you as a private citizen.
Well, mine's
Be-
about -3 this year.
Right,
So.
but because New York state law also requires municipalities to get collateral for all their investments, and it has to be put in a third party. So obviously, there's a cost associated with that on the school district, but they have to comply with the laws.
They're in interest-bearing savings accounts. We are not invested in stocks or anything.
But it's anything you could pull out and easily access at any point in time?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then the last slide, I'm sorry, it's just you went down a path that I got a little bit confused on. Are you saying that you booked some of that as contra revenue? Like, so when you were saying, one of your first statements on the slide is that, you know, we will take something against the revenue, I thought you said.
That's
Is that-
the appropriated fund balance.
Yeah, yes.
Okay.
It's not a contra revenue, it's a component of this 100 million.
Okay.
So of this 100 million, just to use round numbers, we'll have $80 million of tax levy, we'll have $15 million of state aid, we'll have $3 million of other revenues, and then we'll have $2 million of appropriate fund balance to make up our total $100 million budget.
Okay.
So you're returning the prior year's surpluses to reduce your tax needs.
It's an offset.
And I remember seeing that.
Right, the way that I describe it is a budgeted loss in revenue. Because while it's part of this $100 million, we know that we're not actually gonna get the actual dollars. They're not coming. It's using our savings. So again, you know, our whole goal is to break even. We've done a very good job of breaking even over the past 4 years. And in the year where we had a good year, our finance committee wisely chose to use that money to our benefit to pay down debt to offset future years' interest expense. And why do we want to keep our fund balance? Well, we want to do it for a couple of reasons. We just mentioned we want to use it to protect us from catastrophic issues like, God forbid, mold. But we also want to keep it to maintain our bond rating. So while the controller's office is encouraging school districts, spend down your reserves, spend down your fund balance, go to zero, bond rating agencies are saying you need more money in reserves, you need more fund balance, you need more reserves, and that makes you healthier. So we're serving two different purposes here. In Brewster, we're just trying to maintain. We're just trying to maintain, and that's what we've done a pretty good job of doing over the past couple of years. You can see just in 4 years, our fund balance has only increased by about $600,000 over a 4-year span. Again, keep in mind, 600 sounds like a lot of money. We have a $98 million budget. So our next budget workshops, thank you so much for coming, and please continue to ask us questions, and we really want these to be interactive, so I appreciate you asking questions during the slides so that we can take a minute and really drill down on these things. So December 12th is our next meeting. It's salaries and benefits, which we'll be discussing. January 14th, we're going to have representatives from our principals and directors come here so they can really speak detail about the things that they're requesting in their building and department level budgets. Monday, February 11th is state aid tax cap. Tax cap is thrilling. It's a completely boring formula, but that dictates what we do here. So, the things that we have control over are actually very few and far between, especially when it comes to the revenue side of our budget. The state tells us how much money we're going to get in state aid, and the state tells us what our tax cap is going to be. And other revenues, we're limited in our investments, so we're going to get interest at whatever rates are available, and those don't really move. So again, we have very little control over that, but we'll be discussing in detail those items on February 11th. And new to this year, we want to establish a budget advisory committee. So we sent out an invitation on Mayor's backpack yesterday afternoon. I've embedded the link and I included it in the handout. Included in that also is a charter of what the Budget Advisory Committee's mission will be. And tonight's agenda, we reviewed the PowerPoint presentation. There are a few other items that we just want to make sure that we hit on while we have Chris here to provide us with expertise, although he won't admit that he's an expert.
The budget advisory idea is one that is practiced in other districts. It's pretty common for a group of people outside of, in addition to the school district people, to be involved in looking at, not from an advisory capacity, not a decision-making capacity, but an advisory capacity, all of these things that we described and how and we can be more transparent and share more information with the public so that the public is really fully understands. There's a lot, as Victor said, that we have, our sandbox is pretty defined. We don't have a lot of wiggle room around what we do, and we have to do it in ways that, again, support, our larger vision and mission, why we're doing what we're doing, which is to make sure that we educate all children well and prepare them to be successful in life, work, and future learning. We're also governed by any changes to our state standards. That's been a moving target since about 11, 12 or earlier. There were changes that were made to our ELA curriculum and our math curriculum. Changes have been made again because new standards have been introduced for science. We've moved away from No Child Left Behind to ESSA, which focuses a great deal more on equity and access. So you'll be seeing more requests because it is not only is it I think a good principle, but one that's outlined in ESSA that we should be providing more rigorous courses for children. That and more access to rigorous courses. So not only AP, we have, fortunately, thank you to Mrs. Gosh and the team here at the high school, we're in the candidacy stage for the International Baccalaureate program. But all of those programs and options are now ones that, federal legislation has prescribed that we should make available to all children, without any, fences or barriers for that access. So there'll be other things that will be changing, and we have to change to remain competitive in this region. You can look around, you can talk to all of, your neighbors in the school, or in the surrounding area. Everyone is doing something. No one's standing still. If you stand still, you don't have people who necessarily want to enroll their children in the district. If we're using things that no one else uses because we're not connected to the research and trying to not just meet the standards, but to exceed them, to go beyond what others are doing, and to make sure that we are, making this a place that children have a lot of opportunities to engage in many, many things, from athletics to making sure that they all have access to great, rigorous curriculum and content and any other services and supports that would be needed to make them successful, whether that's mental health or anything else that they would need. So a lot of that has to do with having, a group who's actually talking and living in that world as well, not just the numbers, but the philosophy and the vision that's very much woven into that discussion.
So if anyone has any final questions, thoughts, any recommendations for future workshop topics, please let us know. You can email us at any point. And we thank you for coming this evening.
Yes, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
And we'll, as I said earlier, make sure all of this information is prominently available on our website so that you don't have to click very many. There's not very many clicks needed to get to that place. We might even insert a form, sort of ask Victor form, so that it can go right to you. And
We do, yeah, for each budget year, we have budget@brewsterschools.org, and it's an email that's generated each year, and it's sent to actually the four of us. You two are on.
We'll get on that too, so that we can start hearing from people, those who watch it at home, or that some of you might be talking to. There are many ways to get the questions on the agenda so that we can respond to them in a timely fashion and add them to topics that are coming up in the 101s or as part of the conversation with the budget advisory committee.
And tell them to tune in to to this presentation. It's only an hour.
It's riveting.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Good night. Thank you for coming.